This fall, bring the beauty of the Rabbit Room into your own community with House Moot. It's a self-hosted gathering where your living room, church, or backyard becomes a place for shared stories, songs, and sacred conversations. With recorded sessions, recipes, activities, discussion questions, and a gathering guide, we'll set the table for you. All you have to do is bring the guests. Get everything you need to host your own House Moot at rabbitroom.com/housemoot.
I remember being a boy, he says, maybe 3 or 4 years old, and we were getting ready to visit my grandmother's house, he says. I was ready early because I didn't have much to do, and so I walked out into a very crisp winter night and closed the door behind me. I stood on the threshold, my little feet on the doorstep, and as I looked up into the starry sky, I had this exhilarating sense of joy, of beauty. I said out loud, "I love life." You know, the expression of an earnest young person, but that has stuck with me. It was this huge blessing, this realization that it's all okay, now and ever. It was a moment that set me up for resistance against the despair that would woo me later in life.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Rabbit Room Press has started a new podcast called Rabbit Room Press Presents. It's essentially serialized audiobooks of favorite Rabbit Room Press titles. The first season consisted of the 17 interviews with poets that make up Ben Palpant's book, An Axe for the Frozen Sea. Each episode is a different interview. Besides being an excellent writer in his own right, Ben's a great interviewer. In this episode of the Habit Podcast, I'm handing things over to Rabbit Room Press Presents, and more specifically, to Ben Palpant reading the preface to An Axe for the Frozen Sea, followed by Chapter 1 of that book, his interview with the poet Scott Cairns.
The following is brought to you in partnership with Oasis Audio. Welcome to Rabbit Room Press Presents, a podcast series of great audiobooks, one chapter at a time. As Franz Kafka once said, a book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And we at Rabbit Room Press believe that. So this book, this collection of Ben Palpant's interviews with contemporary poets, aims to awaken what has grown silent within us. We're proud of the good work Ben has done in the writing of this book, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we have.
An Axe for the Frozen Sea by Ben Palpant. Read for you by the author. Preface. If you had told me back when I was just a lad that I would choose to spend much of my 40s in conversation with poets and, worse yet, writing poems myself, I would have kicked you in the shins and run for the hills. I don't think my boy-sized brain could have conceived of a worse insult. Then I met a living poet. It happened this way. I was a senior in high school, holding a paper plate in a potluck line next to a stranger. Because my mother taught me to be polite, I struck up a conversation. "What do you do?" I asked. "I'm a poet," he replied. I thought he was pulling my leg, but his face said otherwise. No smirk, no glint in his eye. I thought every last poet was dead, pinned onto the pages of boring textbooks. But here was a living one, standing next to me, speaking to me in my native tongue. I fled. Then, years later, I faced a health crisis that radically impacted my cognition for an extended period of time. Calamity tends to open our hearts to poetry. During that season of my life, I could not track an argument in prose, but I could follow a line of poetry to where it disappeared in the grass. It became important to my physical and mental stability that I learned to stand still in my heart, to wait patiently until my mind could pick up where the next poetic line offered itself and follow it. In poetry, I found unexpected comfort and, strangely, clarity. At least a kind of clarity, the kind that poetry offers in paradox and metaphor. Poetry offered me insights that drew me deeper into life, and, in particular, my life with Christ. Poetry drew me, as Aslan says in The Last Battle, further up and further in. All these years later, poetry has come to play a significant part in my walk with God, which is why I set out at the start of 2024 to meet as many poets as I could and to spend an hour with each one. Not to pepper them with questions, but to have a conversation that would lead us both further up and further in. Someone will query, why interview poets? To which I answer that I believe the best poets practice seeing what most of us overlook or take for granted. They know how to honor the particularities of human existence, thereby opening our eyes to see ourselves, God, and all of His creation with greater clarity and appreciation, an appreciation that leads from praise to greater praise. Poets draw us to attention. They help us sit up and take note, leading us to the heart of things and beyond the heart of things. In other words, I believe poets can help us become more human, as God intended. Poets, through the ordinary means of the written word, can give us glimpses of the eternal. That's why I wanted these interviews to be less about the questions and answers and more about the human interaction. I wanted them to read like two people trying to dig deeper into what it means to be human. Two friends exploring why poetry matters for all of life. I did not intend to collect these conversations into a book, but it became apparent rather early on that reading them next to each other would be a reinforcing and fulfilling experience. Each interview is interesting and fruitful, but together they strengthen and enrich one another. The title for this book comes from my conversation with Misha Willett, who mentioned Franz Kafka's famous line, "A book must be an axe for the frozen sea within us." It stuck with me, and so I have decided to title the book what I hope it will become, An Axe for the Frozen Sea, starting with the sea that threatens to freeze inside me from time to time. Over the years, poetry has helped break up the sea of ice in my heart, which makes poets, I suppose, axe wielders. I don't mean to describe these poets as people who have weaponized their words, though some of them might embrace that description. I mean that they have chosen the more difficult work of changing hearts. Heart change always begins with the poet, of course, but out of change of heart, the mouth speaks. You will quickly discover that the poets in this book do not always agree. Their convictions vary, as do their practices. One of the interesting convictions they share, however, is that poetry is more than mere self-expression. In our day and age, that's a helpful connecting thread running through the discourse. I think I can say this with certainty as well, that they all agree with Eliot's famous line about writing poetry. Every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure, and so each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate. I will be asked why I included some poets and did not include others. How I wish I could say that I picked these poets for particular reasons. Alas, I can't. I started with 4 poets who lived within driving distance. They, in turn, suggested other poets, and so the project evolved organically. These poets by no means represent an exhaustive list of anything. Some are more famous than others, but fame is no indicator of quality, and only time will tell which poets will have a lasting impact. At the end of the day, the world is full of worthy poets. Find them. Learn from them. Given 1,000 possible ways to structure this book, I opted to organize these poets alphabetically. It allows them to speak to each other and to us without any orchestration on my part. I also have a get-out-of-jail-free card, which I find entirely convenient if anyone complains about the order. The question asked by every undergraduate, is poetry still relevant, is a worthy one. The answer these conversations give is a resounding yes. But how is poetry relevant? Well, the answer to that question is as varied as the poets themselves. When I look over the broad landscape of society, I see a reawakening of interest in and writing of poetry. If I'm correct, we need the best poets, both the living and the dead, to guide us into a deeper relationship with God, with ourselves, and with the world. Lee Young Lee once said, "People who read poetry have heard about the burning bush, but when you write poetry, you sit inside the burning bush." We need poets whose souls are fully awake so that we might glimpse what they sense throbbing at the heart of all things. As the story goes, St. Augustine, weary of writing one day, decided to get some fresh air and walk the beach. He had not walked far when he saw a boy dashing back and forth from the ocean to a tiny hole in the sand. Augustine called out, "Hey there, what are you doing?" The boy lifted a shell which he had been using to transport seawater and cried out, "I'm going to fit the entire sea into this tiny hole I've dug in the sand." Augustine laughed out loud. Spreading his arms wide, he said, "You attempt the impossible, my son. You will never fit this magnificent sea into that little hole." The boy, apparently familiar with the great theologian's efforts, called back, "And you will never fit the Holy Trinity inside your head." Well, imagine that there were two boys instead of only one, or a boy and a girl. Would their success rate improve? Hardly, but it would be good sport to watch. I suppose that's what these conversations amount to in the end. It's just two people trying to spoon the ocean into a tiny hole for an hour or so, doing our darndest not to spill a single drop along the way. If you are a poet, this book is for you. May it inspire, instruct, and strengthen you for the work God has given you to do. If you are not a poet, may it remind you that words matter, that poetry matters, and that you matter, not in that particular order. Most of all, may these conversations spur us on to call out to God who loves to answer, so that He will show us great and mighty things which we did not know. Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 3. Ben Palpant, September 2024. Chapter 1, Scott Cairns. Scott Cairns lives in a modest house, the house of his childhood, a house his father built. It is as unpretentious and welcoming as those who call it home. Standing together in the kitchen, gazing at Puget Sound, I am struck by the spirit in this place, the same spirit that infuses his poetry, an open-handed generosity, a down-to-earth gentleness, a wry, disarming humor. He leads me downstairs into a sunroom lined with windows and gives me first dibs on where I want to sit. I select the old love seat built out of bamboo. He's drinking his coffee from a mug that says, 7 days without a pun makes 1 week. Glancing around the room, I notice the unremarkable furniture, the shelf lined with plants, the children's box set of Beatrix Potter books. It all strikes me as incredibly unassuming. The observation that comes to mind could seem insulting, but I choose to make it anyway. "You don't seem to take yourself too seriously," I suggest. "Well," he says, "I guess going to a lot of poetry readings over the years, listening to other poets, I find myself thinking, you don't have to be that severe, dude." He grins. "So yes, I usually open my poems with a joke, and then at some point, I get a little more serious and the irony falls away. If you were raised in this home as I was, irony was a requirement, and puns were also required. How did Naomi Shihab Nye put it? Answer if you hear the words under the words. That is very similar to what I have said endlessly to my students, which is, pay attention to the words within the words. Maybe you could help me understand what you mean by that, I say. I've noticed, he says, that the poems I love most are poems that I can keep reading and opening because during a given reading, I will have seen a primary sense of the word, but then see how the secondary and tertiary senses also figure into it. This is mostly why I started learning Greek and why I'm trying to learn a little Latin. It's because, as you must know, the English language is the best language for poetry. It's a museum for almost all the other languages. And so the etymological hauntings within an English word of its Greek or Latin roots may not be so overt, but they're present. If you're attentive to those ghosts, the poem keeps opening for you. It's never the same poem with each reading. I want to make poems like that, poems that keep opening. We should be cognizant that writing poems isn't about saying what you think you know. It's really about constructing a scene of meaning-making, a field into which a reader can enter and make meaning with the poet. There really ought to be some ambiguity implicated in every line, I think. Does the ambiguity play into line breaks for you, I ask? How do you make decisions on line endings? I am almost always counting something. That's one technical element of lineation. I also want my lines to register as a provisional syntactical unit, which is then modified by subsequent lines. Often, for instance, the word out here at the end of the line appears to be a noun, but then it turns out that it's an adjective modifying an actual noun waiting in the next line. That provides a wonderful, dizzying experience for the reader, who then is obliged to take another look at what he just read, and his rereading proves essential to the agency of what I like to call the poetic operation of language. Which is what we like about our favorite poems, I say. He nods and takes a drink from his mug. Poetry, he says, when it's really poetry, occasions this sort of spinning, vertiginous, I like the word vertiginous, operation of language. You can also witness this in a rich prose text. Poetry, of course, can happen in verse or prose. Even fiction, nonfiction, and drama can obtain some degree of this poetic operation of language, this delicious, puzzling, opening activity. A great novel like Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, a book I read every summer, does this. It keeps opening me onto something new. He pauses and gazes out the window. I really do feel that when I'm making a poem, it's not about having a glimpse of something true and then trying to transcribe it. It's more like trying to figure it out, glimpsing it as I go, wrestling with the language, listening to the music of the words, letting the music lead me to the next words. And then in that way, my compositional practice is also my meditation. He thinks for a moment. I guess for the first half of my life, I resisted the equation between poetry and prayer. Over the past 20 years, however, I have approached my poems as a kind of prayer, perhaps my most efficacious prayer. It sounds to me like your favorite poets force you to calibrate to mystery, I say, but that's also partly why you write. You're calibrating to the divine mystery. Well, yes, because I'm my first audience. I want to get something out of it too, he laughs. You should know that I really only have 5 ideas. I think they're pretty good ideas, but to the extent that ideation occurs in any of my poems ever, they're pretty much the same 5 ideas retooled, if opening a little more onto a fuller glimpse each time I work it over. One of the hardest things for young readers to figure out is that there really is no hidden code in the poem. The reader's purpose is not to crack the code and replace the poem with a paraphrase of the poem. No, a genuine poem is actually a place you enter and experience, a place in which you collaborate in meaning-making. While he takes another drink from his mug, I consider the room around me quietly before beginning my thought. When I drove up to your house today, I say, I thought of your house as just a house. A very modest house, he replies. But when you told me that your dad built this house, my perspective shifted. In a way, I walked through this house differently. It seems as though poems, if we think of them as a place, should be entered with a different kind of respect. I'm not just entering an apartment that is produced en masse. I'm entering a place that had a great deal of meaning long before I entered it. Ah, a dwelling place, he suggests. Yes. How do you enter a poem with that kind of respect? Well, he says, I suppose when I start reading, I'm not looking for any inspiration, anything to take. I'm just ingesting the page, you know. If it draws me back later, if I keep going back to the poem again and again, then something grows out of that thorough reading. It's the poets like W.H. Auden, C.P. Cavafy that I come back to. Do you know Cavafy? He was a Greek poet living in Alexandria, Egypt, in the early 20th century. He's a fantastic poet. I have certain other poets, Mark Strand, Anthony Hecht. Anyway, I spend a lot of time with them, you see. They become sort of my primary audience. They write to me, I write to them. Richard Howard was one of my beloved mentors, one of the best-read guys I've met. I pore over the works of these people and hope that some of it rubs off. I end up writing to satisfy them more than to satisfy, I don't know, the living. He continues, I want students to be less concerned with what the author is saying and more concerned with what they can literally make with the poem on the page. The entire literary history is really all about a conversation that has been going on for centuries. To be part of that conversation, first you have to read to find out what that conversation is, and let the utterances of other writers provoke your responses. The more you're equipped by the prior discourse, the more likely you are to make something interesting with it, something that might actually contribute to the ongoing conversation. Let's talk about calibrating to mystery, I say. During difficult times of life, do you find yourself writing more or less? It has probably varied over the years, he replies. As an escape from the turmoil, yes. Sometimes just saying, to heck with it, I'm going to work on this poem, is a great thing. Other times, things are going well and I still get the legal pad out and start reading again. Most of my writing time, you see, begins with reading time. I'll be poring over a book and eventually I glimpse something new. My legal pad and number 2 pencils are out and ready, so I start responding to whatever glimpses I just had. I start looking for more openings onto new glimpses in this new work. So there's this linguistic dynamic at work that continues to give, to push me, to open me. Do you leave unfinished poems out and about so they're always calling to you, I ask? You saw my desk, he chuckles. I think that would qualify as out and about. At some point, I'll move them to the laptop. You strike me as a poet who isn't under some delusion that he's arrived, I say. There's always something to pursue, to learn. The older I get, he replies, the more I feel I have to achieve, and the more I feel like I'm not going to make it, that I'm going to run out of time. He laughs. That's pretty much a guarantee. Do you feel the weight that John Keats felt when he had fears that he may cease to be, when he beheld cloudy symbols that he may never live to trace their shadows? Do you feel that? I've always been cognizant of death, but it's a little more present as I age, yes. But I think of Samuel Coleridge. He was always trying to mine something. I've found his continual reaching to be compelling. I never want to give in to the notion that if something comes easily, I should keep doing that thing. How have you wrestled with public praise, I ask? How have you kept it from warping your work? Well, I guess I avoid it as much as possible, he says, before taking another sip. I've never been good at taking compliments. Maybe it's just part of my deflecting humor. One of the best ways to defend against poor effect upon one's character is to know some genuinely brilliant people. It keeps you humble. Of course, I also have friends who don't read poetry at all. I don't think it's for everyone. I think you need to have a taste for uncertainty, which is a taste I think most people don't share. Most people are profoundly burdened by practical matters. They may feel that they have no room for uncertainty, but that feeling keeps them from discovering, keeps them from a deep species of joy. Uncertainty is a great gift. I think uncertainty is a truer disposition than certainty. For instance, God is not reducible to anything we can say about God. God necessarily always exceeds what we might make of God. So too, the truth necessarily always exceeds what we can narrowly define. If we think we can enclose the truth or enclose God, we're not talking about truth and we're not talking about God. Could we take a moment to talk about the next generation of writers, I ask? What are some of the missteps you see young writers taking? The only time I really get distressed about my students, he replies, is when marketing and self-promotion starts taking up too much of their attention and time. I think self-promotion is a really bad idea for a couple of reasons, the greatest of which is that you start thinking that public attention is how you know your work is good. Applause and acclaim are not how you know something has quality. Witnessing all the self-promotion they're doing, I feel very sad. I start to wonder if maybe I forgot to say something to them when I had the chance, something important. Are you suggesting, I ask, that the market economy has no overlap with poetry? No, marketing has a place, but the poet shouldn't be the one to do it. The poet should have some really great friends who love to share his work with other people. So he can focus on the work, I add. Truly, yes, just do the work. I'm not saying you shouldn't send your work out for publication, but I spend probably an hour a month thinking about what I have on hand to send out and who I should send it to. Then I send it off and forget about it. I get back to work. That seems to me a healthy ratio. But more than that, I think that a daily Instagram post about your deep thoughts doesn't seem like a good use of your deep thoughts. I don't get angry about marketing. I don't get resentful. And yes, I think writers really do get noticed that way, but I just mostly feel sad for folks who get swept up in it. You wrote a book called Idiot Psalms. One of my personal favorites is Psalm 2, a psalm of Isaac accompanied by baying hounds. Who is Isaac? There actually was a Saint Isaac of Syria, he says. He was a 7th century monastic who was bishop for about 3 hours before he fled to the desert. I first came upon him while reading the brothers Karamazov. One of the characters is said to have read the ascetical homilies of St. Isaac the Syrian nearly every day, understanding none of it. So that's the actual St. Isaac. When I became Orthodox, I took the name Isaac. He is my name saint, as we say. Now, when I take communion, they don't call me Scott, they call me Isaac. So these poems and others of mine are understood to be spoken by a persona, Isaac the least. Would you read the poem? I ask. Absolutely. O shaper of varicolored clay and cellulose, O keeper of same, O subtle tweaker, agent of energies both appalling and unobserved, do not allow your servant's limbs to stiffen or to ossify unduly. Do not compel your servant to go brittle, neither cramping at the heart, nor narrowing his affective sympathies, neither of the flesh, nor of the alleged soul. Keep me sufficiently limber, that I might continue to enjoy my morning run among the lilies and the rowdy waterfowl, that I might delight in this and every evening's intercourse with the woman you have set beside me. Make me to awaken daily with a willingness to roll out readily, accompanied by grateful smirk, a giddy joy, the idiot's undying expectation, despite the evidence. Thank you, I say. I love that final stanza so much that I wrote it down in my journal several years ago, so I could look at it regularly. Well, I wrote what I hoped for myself, you know. The evidence is not promising, but there is a grace in supposing that despite how unpromising the surrounding evidence, the circumstances of our political lives, our civic lives, our individual progress towards holiness, there is an inescapable deep note of joy that I've been blessed with and count on. What a gift, I reply. I remember being a boy, he says, maybe 3 or 4 years old, and we were getting ready to visit my grandmother's house, he says. I was ready early because I didn't have much to do, and so I walked out into a very crisp winter night and closed the door behind me. I stood on the threshold, my little feet on the doorstep, and as I looked up into the starry sky, I had this exhilarating sense of joy, of beauty. I said out loud, I love life. You know, the expression of an earnest young person, but that has stuck with me. It was this huge blessing, this realization that it's all okay, now and ever. It was a moment that set me up for resistance against the despair that would woo me later in life. Here's one of my favorite poems by Scott Cairns titled Imperative. The thing to remember is how tentative all of this really is. You could wake up dead, or the woman you love could decide you're ugly. Maybe she'll finally give up trying to ignore the way you floss your teeth when you watch television. All I'm saying is that there are no sure things here. I mean, you'll probably wake up alive, and she'll probably keep putting off any actual decision about your looks. Could be she'll be glad your teeth are so clean. The morning could be full of all the love and kindness you need. Just don't go thinking you deserve any of it.
An Axe for the Frozen Sea is published by Rabbit Room Press. The audiobook is published by Oasis Audio. Copyright by Ben Palpant, 2024. Music by Chris Badaker.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.